Welcome, everyone, to the Electric Wire podcast. I'm your host, Kristen Jilks. I'm the executive director of the Customers First Coalition, and the Electric Wire is a production of the Customers First Coalition. Our coalition was founded over 2 decades ago to preserve Wisconsin's affordable and reliable electricity. Thanks to everyone who listened in for last month's episode, which focused on solar panel recycling. We're going to hit on some of those recycling and reuse themes in today's conversation with Daniel Witt of Lucid Motors. We've linked to Lucid's website in the show notes. Essentially, Lucid is an electric vehicle startup that's on the cutting edge of battery innovation, and I encourage you to check out more about them. I also want to drive one of these cars after visiting their website, and I think you'll enjoy the conversation in this episode that touches on Lucid's plans for EV battery reuse, localizing supply chains, and policies around electric vehicles. I'm going to turn you over to my interview with Daniel Witt from Lucid now, but I also want to promise before we get started that we will still have an episode of wind turbine blade recycling in the coming months, so stay tuned for that one. Thanks everybody for listening. Daniel, tell us more about yourself, your background, and how you got to Lucid.
Yeah, so my name is Daniel Witt. I'm the head of state and local public policy for Lucid Motors. I've been with the company for almost a year and a half at this point, prior to which I spent about 7 years with what was the more original EV startup, Tesla. And I cut my teeth in the automotive industry there, focusing on first federal and then state affairs. Really, all over the course of their history, through the launch of the Model S, the Model X, the Model 3, the Tesla semi-truck, the launch of the supercharger program, as well as a myriad of other issues that came on during that. So prior to that point, I'd worked in Congress for the U.S. Senate, working on a myriad of issues, including transportation and infrastructure projects, high-speed rail. So at one point, I had the opportunity to sort of, the embedded joke was I was a mass transit guy working for a car company. But now with all of the different micro mobility options and different players in the space, that joke doesn't get nearly the traction that it once
That's
did.
funny.
So I'm just happy to say I've been in this industry for 10 years and and have the gray hair to prove it.
Nice. I like that your background is in sustainable transportation and you see EVs fitting right into that.
Yeah. I mean, I admit, I approach this from a rather specific prism. I've always viewed electrified transportation, specifically in the light duty space, but even more expansively across all the different transportation modes, as a step change in development for the industry, but nonetheless one that was attainable based on the technology that has been recently commercialized, and really imperative. Both from a sustainability context, environmental context, but frankly also just in terms of the evolution of our economies. We all know the stories of sort of the lack of thriving within the middle class, and so much of that has come from, I think, an interdependency on a really global scale with the supply chain that enables internal combustion engine vehicles to thrive. And that has been successful in some respects in the last 100 years, but really what we're seeing now is, the benefits of electric technology being allowing, every American to take a little bit more control even of their finances, lower maintenance costs, lower total cost of ownership stemming from the lower and more predictable refueling costs that come with working in the working in partnership with regulated utilities. So I think as with many things that we're seeing now, you're seeing the blend of automotive and technology and energy all coming together. It can be discordant, but on the other hand, if you can establish some harmony, you can really make some music with that. And that's been sort of a constant vision as I've been sort of growing up in the industry, and certainly seems to be something that, you know, we hope can manifest in the coming years.
You touched on something that I really feel in my core, and that is the driver experience of electric vehicles. We all talk about the environmental benefits and the cost benefits, but having driven an electric vehicle for 4 years now, I wouldn't go back no matter what, because the driver experience is just so good. They're fun cars to drive. I love not having to stop for gas. I still go to my nearby Quick Trip twice a day, but it's just not to fill up on gas, and I'm really happy that way. Okay, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the benefits of rethinking the automobile from the ground up as an electric vehicle is going back to first principles in terms of what the vehicle can be. You can have a better driving experience. You can have a safer driving experience. I mean, I think, you know, we as Americans have been sort of socialized to forget that there is literally a gas tank sitting below you when you're in an internal combustion engine vehicle the responsibility of, you know, as that gas is transferred into the engine is to combust. And granted, it's a very controlled explosion, but ultimately, as we're emerging into this world of electric vehicles, we've been able to, you know, revisit even going to the structural elements of the vehicle to create a better vehicle, better riding experience, quicker, safer, and that's not something that is just specific to Lucid. We really think this is industry wide. Now we can talk a little bit about, you know, what I think makes, you know, the Lucid Air a really cool car, but you know, all to say, I'm really high on especially the offerings that are coming out from a variety of manufacturers, or are planned to in the next coming years.
So tell us more about how Lucid fits in this space. Tell us more about the history of Lucid and where you guys are at right now.
Yeah, so I think it's worth pointing out that, you know, we started the last century with the Model T, right? Actually, before that, you had some electric vehicles, as you know, people are quick to point out, but really the mass industrialization of the automobile started with the Model T, and you ended up with the Toyota Prius in 1998. And over that 100 years, you had the evolution of the automobile, not only in terms of manufacturing practices, not only in terms of the construction of and the engineering of the vehicles, the safety of the vehicles, the performance of the vehicles. That all occurred over a 100-year gap from Model T to hybrid. What we're seeing is this much quicker evolution with electric vehicles, but we also shouldn't presume that we've reached the panacea of what can be achieved just because you've had so much focus on a Nissan Leaf or a Tesla Model S or a Tesla Model 3. There are still plenty of advancements that have yet to come. And Lucid represents, you know, one of these key step changes that we think the rest of the industry is going to be keen to adopt in the coming years. Our technology has been miniaturized and has been advanced such that we will be the first vehicle to achieve a 500 plus mile range using the same size battery pack as what's being used by the current range leader that gets about 400 miles of range. So we're able to actually stretch those batteries a little bit farther, you know, a little bit more efficiently to enable a much longer range. And we think this is really the key to mass adoption. We can create vehicles with longer and longer range as batteries get cheaper and cheaper. But my CEO likes to point out that that's dumb range, effectively. That's throwing more weight at the range problem. What you need to be able to do is create more range out of less cells, because that tends to be the most expensive part of the car. And so if you can take cost out of the car, you can start to reach that mass market price point with a truly competitive range or comparable range to what drivers currently buy. And if you're able to take care of that that big inhibitor right now, cost, and you've got the value principles of better performance, safer, better total cost of ownership, then you've gone a long way towards ultimately making a car that is really marketable to the masses. And what's left over, of course, is going to be infrastructure. Just to put a button on it, though, Lucid Air, we're getting ready to come to production with that before the end of this year. 500 plus miles of range, but it's exceedingly efficient. You've got 0 to 60 times below 2.5 seconds. You've got what we refer to as the space concept, which again, when you're building an electric vehicle from the ground up, you can really realize all of the vacant space created by putting the batteries in the floorboards and by miniaturizing the motor. And so there's just a lot of interior space in what is a sedan, but it's not the largest sedan out there. And so ultimately, it's thinner than the Model S, but about the same size from nose to tail. All of which is going to make it, a very competitive offering in the luxury platform. But I'd caution everyone that while this technology is expensive and we've gone to the premium market with intentionality, we don't believe that this technology belongs, in a high price point forever. We're very keen to actually partner with other manufacturers to get our technology, this miniaturized technology, into mass market vehicles to do exactly what I stated before. We believe that this technology, whether it's in a light duty vehicle, last mile transit or transportation, commercial van, or even moving into the 80,000 pound tractor trailer Class 8 vehicles, we think that this technology really transitions across all those modes and can make electrification truly achievable in all of those different categories.
I was reading online as I did some Googling before our conversation, and I saw someone did a review of their drive in a Lucid Air from Los Angeles to San Francisco.
Right.
Which is a pretty long trip. They had nothing but great things to say. But can you just tell us a little bit more about what the driving experience is like in the Lucid Air?
I think the best way to, the engineers have done an amazing job in creating an exceedingly refined interior, and it's an incredibly smooth ride. But for your average consumer who gets in there, it's the antithesis of range anxiety. There's range confidence in a vehicle like that, like an internal combustion engine vehicle. You just don't think about how far that car can get you. You can just enjoy the ride. And I think that's really a key thing for it. We're not saying that every vehicle needs to have a range in excess of 500 miles. But it is more a mindset that we ultimately need to sort of recondition Americans around. And this is a vehicle that ultimately enables you to just enjoy the California scenery and truly get from point A to point B. I think they were probably hypermiling it and trying to conserve their energy and so forth. But having a 0 to 60 time of 2.5 seconds and with the top speed that it has, you can get there pretty quick too if that was your druthers.
So what kind of batteries are you using in this vehicle?
So they're lithium ion chemistry batteries, cylindrical cells. Not anything they're very standardized within the industry at this point. The key distinction for us is not really the cells themselves, but how we package them in the modules, and then ultimately the advancements we've made with the other components that make up the powertrain. I spoke before about miniaturization. We actually combined the motor and the inverter, which ultimately into one casing. And so what that really means is, as opposed to transferring the energy from one area of the car to another, we've created this process that allows for the most minimal transfer of energy. And anyone who remembers their physics class will remember that the transfer of energy results in heat loss, or I should say in heat and energy loss. And so when you don't have that energy loss, you can apply more of that energy directly to what its intended what its intended use is.
How long are you anticipating that the batteries will last in these vehicles?
Yeah, it's always a tricky question, because the battery chemistries have been refined over the last 10 years, right? In Nissan Leaf, you've got a range of 80 to 100 miles. That's a fundamentally different car than one that goes 500 miles and hasn't even been produced yet. So car companies will do life cycle testing and iterations of battery chemistries when we qualify those the cells to be used in our vehicles. So we have a general sense of how robust they are, but like an internal combustion engine, the car is going to last. The car greatly depends on the driver to know exactly how far it's going to last. Now, there's a lot of conversation out there about a 1,000,000-mile battery. And I think that the industry as a whole can ultimately look at that as sort of a goalpost, but very rarely are consumers going to own a vehicle for that length of time, right? The general principle that we go with is that by the time the vehicle should last for as long as a consumer intends. And frankly, we expect the interior wear and tear to be the first notice of any aging, but ultimately, we're looking at these vehicles being retired even beyond second and third ownership with 80%, 70% of their total battery capacity still intact. And so that gets to our whole vision of what happens to these batteries after they go through their useful life in a vehicle.
So then what happens? Right. So after they've gone through their useful life in the vehicle,
yeah,
you guys have plans.
There's a lot of focus right now on recycling. And I think that's very fair. We do want to know what happens at the end of the rainbow with these cells, the process by which we pull or we gather the raw materials out of the cells and the modules, and ultimately create more of a closed loop system. We need to start talking about what that looks like. However, I just got done saying that we're anticipating a lot of battery capacity being still in the cells, even when the vehicle has concluded its useful life. Recycling the batteries at that point doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's actually very inefficient. So something that we have aspirations to do is to leverage those modules and take them out of the car and ultimately utilize them in a stationary storage context. This industry is in a period of rapid growth. We know it's something that utilities are interested in terms of providing an ancillary service in support of peaking hours in the grid. It's something we know consumers have an interest in, as we're dealing with greater instability from the grid, either from snowstorms or fires or whatever, just for the purposes of redundancy and to offset the need for a generator. Frankly, we think as we're still working through the development of this process, so too is the rest of this industry. So we can't share a lot of details about the product at this point, other than to say that we think prior to getting to recycling, there's the reuse portion that we think deserves a little bit of a greater focus and attention, just because there seems to be a whole lot of energy capacity there that someone could take advantage of prior to the inevitability of recycling that material and ultimately pushing it back into the supply chain.
For our listeners, I'm going to put a link in the show notes. It's from TechCrunch, and the headline is Lucid Motors sees a second life for its EV batteries in energy storage. And that's essentially what Daniel is talking about right now is storage systems that serve as a battery to help when the sun's not shining or the wind's not blowing, help store
energy for when it's needed most, whether that's on a residence or at a substation. The new technologies are just growing.
Yeah. Now, Kristen. Yeah. No. I think that's perfect. But the thing that the TechCrunch article did mention, and something we're more keen to discuss now, because it's a known feature of the vehicle, is the bidirectional charging infrastructure. And so what we often, vehicle to grid applications have been talked about since the advent of the Nissan Leaf and the Chevy Spark back in 2010. At the time, manufacturers were rather keen to see the storage packs, the battery packs, utilized for their intended purpose. And that's been the line from the industry up until this point. What I'm here to say is that with a 500 plus mile range vehicle, very rarely are you going to be doing the drive from LA to San Francisco, which leaves a certain energy capacity in your vehicle there on a daily basis that could potentially have monetary value to something like the grid and the utility operators. Now, I think that this concept is extremely nascent and deserving of a lot of study and ultimately, information from every stakeholders. But imagine that if we started seeing a lot, mass commercialization of longer range vehicles, where the capacity of those packs is far greater than any of the at-home stationary packs. Now they're mobile, which means they might be less predictable. But imagine the utility that's able to harness that energy that they ultimately didn't pay for, that the consumer ultimately is bringing to the table, but could ultimately be used as a demand response measure, a grid asset, an ancillary asset for grid stability purposes. I think there's a lot of potential there. And so this kind of gets to Lucid's full circle approach, which is you have the very impressive technology in the vehicle, but that unlocks all kinds of other opportunities when it comes to this that's complementary to the entire energy sector, whether it's storage in a mobile context or storage in a stationary context. Eventually, there's there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of intersectionality that it could enable a lot of opportunity for engagement, both between the company and utilities, but also the customer and utilities, but really represent this sort of 21st century grid where there's a little bit more interdependency, but at the end of that, there's actually lower costs for everybody.
Oh, we could do a whole nother podcast on that.
We could.
We talk about the vehicle to grid charging possibilities. I have gotten questions about what happens when there's massive power outages. Like, look at what's happening in New Orleans right now. Would you have just needed to charge your vehicle before the storm hits, or like what happens if there's a storm and people are not able to charge their vehicles, or an outage, or any type? Are there plans to address that?
Well, yeah, I think first of all, what's happening in New Orleans is terrible, and it's not just New Orleans, right? We saw this happen in Florida with recent hurricanes. We saw it happen with Texas in the wintertime. We're seeing, mandatory evacuations in California right now because of all the fires. In any case where there is a power outage, it's not just the electric vehicles that have problems. It's gas stations too. And so, ultimately the reason that you're creating this distinction between the technologies is because of the accessibility of gasoline versus the accessibility of stored energy that could be used to supply larger amounts of electric vehicles. I think this is an emerging space that ultimately needs to get worked out. But when you have charging stations that are supplemented, it could very well be as simple as, in climates where you're likely to see, major major disasters, from hurricanes and storms and the like, that charging stations should be supported by stationary storage devices in order to encourage an additional level of robustness and emergency benefit to consumers, as they may need a quick charge on the way out of an evacuation zone. The other aspect that you alluded to, though, is sort of the public good aspect, which is, if you've got a bunch of electric vehicles in a marketplace and you've got all of this energy that's potentially stored, wouldn't it be great that within a power outage, that within an immediate transmission area, those electric vehicles could support a broader set of houses or functions on the grid. Now, this is heavily contingent upon transmission infrastructure and a host of other things that, again, I think we have to work through. But I think now in the coming decade, you're going to see this growth in the electric vehicle market, such that utilities, this is the time to start planning for those sorts of scenarios, because the utility that gets this right the first time, that has an outage but ultimately is able to provide basic services, really is living up to its reputation for reliable service, and its annual rate of return. These are the situations that I think we have to start anticipating, and creating. I'm not sure it's going to be acceptable, for everyday consumers to continue to sort of deal with intermittent or even serious outages on a repeated basis. There's going to have to be solutions, and this is just one part of that.
So Daniel, I saw you last week testifying before a legislative committee in Wisconsin. I was watching on Wisconsin Eye, as I'm sure some of our listeners were as well. So we heard you testifying on a bill. I wanted to give you a chance to talk more about what you're working on with your legislative agenda here in Wisconsin. Yeah,
first of all, let me just say, this is my first opportunity to testify before the Wisconsin legislature. Very impressed. I've gone to many state capitals. It's one of the privileges of my line of work, and I want to commend Wisconsinites for their state capital. There's a lot to say about just how nice it is and how representative it is of the people. But all to say, this was a great opportunity, I think, for me to come before the committee to talk about what is a sort of thorny issue in the rise of adoption of electric vehicles. It's principally that there are some manufacturers, Tesla being the first but not the last, Lucid, Rivian are amongst a new cohort, that all seek a more direct relationship with consumers. That has been made possible by the internet, of all things. The traditional format for distribution of vehicles that's been widely successful over the last 100 years has been to use a franchise dealer. And yet, as we're seeing this competition, this growing competition between internal combustion engine vehicles, which are they are the cornerstone of the business model that has allowed franchise dealers to thrive. However, that is, frankly, incompatible, we think, with the rise in the adoption of electric vehicles. And the manufacturers that have gone out on a ledge to ultimately be advocates and push this industry towards full electrification have done so by virtue of making their case and taking their case directly to consumers. It's partly why in Wisconsin, you've got 2/3 of electric vehicles being sold directly from a manufacturer to a consumer at this point. That number, candidly, is even higher, above 80% in a lot of other states. And so there's this direct correlation right now between enabling manufacturers who want to sell directly to consumers and the success of electric vehicles in those states. And so Wisconsin, candidly, has not been as successful with the promotion of electric vehicles, or frankly, the economic benefits of this transition, not only for consumers, but what we've shown, actually, what the dealers have shown via their own studies, is that states that allow direct sales sell more vehicles in total, EV and otherwise. They have higher growth in employment, and they lose less of their franchise dealers. And I would submit that's probably because of more competition, but that's for greater minds than I to ultimately figure out. And so this hearing was really about providing policymakers in Wisconsin with the education around those statistics, and to say, look, this isn't a binary choice. It's not a zero-sum game. You can support your hometown dealers, whether that's the more urban dealers or those that represent the more rural communities, while still enabling more competition and supporting a more open marketplace. At the end of the day, this is about Lucid being able to invest in Wisconsin, but even more so about consumers having their choice of vehicle and how they want to ultimately purchase that vehicle. So we're optimistic. We think there's a lot of potential for this legislation this year, and I think that it's no secret, or I should say it's timed with there being a greater appetite for electric vehicles in the state. So we think it makes a lot of sense, and we're hopeful that we can make some headway on that this year.
Thanks. So do you see any other obstacles to greater electric vehicle adoption or greater electrification opportunities in Wisconsin besides this law?
Yeah, I mean, this law is sort of it's a sticky issue, but it's sort of I think a necessary one to address. But it also is not the biggest issue. One of the benefits of having a longer range vehicle like a Lucid, 500 miles, is that you can actually as a state or a municipality or as a utility get much more intentional around the type of charging scenarios that you want to support. We know that an overwhelming majority of consumers charges their vehicle at home overnight if they have that option. And you want to support that. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I mean, it's so convenient. You wake up every morning with a full tank of energy.
I tell people it's like charging your phone, essentially.
Exactly, it's like charging your phone. It's that predictable. And so making that available to more consumers, so that they can realize the convenience, but also, frankly, the economics, because energy is invariably going to be cheaper overnight. These are big. These require, they consume a lot of energy, and so ultimately being able to refuel for what is actually pennies on the dollar when you compare it to refueling at a gas station. We need to make that proposition a reality for every consumer, especially those that are at lower incomes, who would benefit from that change, that lower total cost of ownership, that lower maintenance costs, even more directly. I heard one of the CEOs for a charging company talk about this concept in a really interesting way. He said, if you have an electric car, and you are able to get a less affluent neighborhood to support electric cars, that whole neighborhood just got a raise, because invariably the fuel costs associated with an internal combustion engine vehicle and as well the maintenance costs become a source of dependency on an individual's income that just goes away. And having that more flexible income actually creates a greater gross domestic product within an immediate community. It can have a transformational it can have a transformational impact, but it all starts with accessibility. And so creating a charging network that enables that principal point of charging is absolutely critical. And if you can't enable it at a person's home, then creating its alternative in the form of fast charging infrastructure is, I think, the next best thing. But utilities have to play a role in that, because ultimately that fast charging infrastructure would normally come at a premium given the higher capacity charging that's required. And that can offset the lower total cost of ownership that we just described. So there is a public policy area to deal with there. The whole other end of the spectrum is around fast charging infrastructure and enabling people to get from one corner of the state to the other. That to me is the easier one, just because we know where people are going. We know what are the destinations that we want to incent people to go to. We even know what the limits are of the technology to this point. The CCS standard is standardized at 350 kilowatts, and that's a lot of energy, but that enables you to get 300 of 500 miles of range recharged in 20 minutes. And during that time, people are getting out using the facilities, grabbing a sandwich, and going to their local Quick Trip, and ultimately, it's that similar a behavior to what they are accustomed to. When you focus on those two particular areas, I think you can be more efficient with your use of funds, but you also capture a much larger chunk of the pie to enable that those mass adoption that mass adoption scenario. We can't underestimate, and I don't think we are. Candidly, there's a lot of conversation about infrastructure being an inhibitor to mass adoption. I'll agree with that to an extent, if only because I think it's a solvable issue. And it really is just a matter of people convincing themselves that this change is upon us, that the investments they make today and in the coming years ultimately will have a return on value. And candidly, as you can tell, I going back to the beginning, I spent 10 years in this industry. I'd like to attest to the fact that there are signs from the rest of the industry in terms of their aspirations and their embrace of electric vehicle technology that we are approaching a future where where more models will be available, and this type of future that I've described really can be a reality. But it is going to take a lot of different parts. It's that interdependency I talked about. That's the tough part, is getting everybody to act as a cohesive unit to bring about the changes necessary to really see this become a reality.
Are there any other greater industry efforts on sustainability or recycling that you wanted to talk about?
I do think that we can get into sort of the thinking exercise of, what the perfect system looks like. But at the end of the day, you need the infrastructure and the supply chains established. And this is one of in order to actually make that a reality. This is one of the things that I talk about in states that frankly have a history in the automotive industry, or frankly, those who haven't at all. Electrification offers a complete redistribution of that supply chain within the United States. We are candidly we are behind China and the EU in terms of the adoption of policies to create a domestic supply chain. It is going to be incumbent not only on the federal government, but states who believe in this vision to ultimately make it a reality. And it's not just touching on consumer incentives or working just directly with light duty manufacturers. It needs to be holistic. And if you can start to think along the lines of mineral extraction or production and manufacturing of EVSE equipment, or energy storage equipment, or any aspect of an electric vehicle that is specific to an electric vehicle, you're not only endorsing the promotion of that technology for consumers, but you as a state start to capture the value of that supply chain, and that's a system that is currently in development that should be looked at by every state as an opportunity for jobs and investment from private companies. And ultimately, I think can solidify a lot of great blue collar jobs that will contribute to the next 100 years of transportation here in America.
When you talk about a local supply chain, are there policies out there that people are talking about to help make that actually happen?
I can't honestly say that I'm aware of any effort by any state that's gotten this totally right. Some are really focused on the manufacturing side. Some are most focused on consumers, and for different reasons, right? You might have really bad air quality in a state, so you want to see the vehicles in the state as soon as possible, and that's going to direct your resources towards a certain element. Or frankly, if you're a state that's suffering in terms of the lack of manufacturing jobs, you might be more focused on the other end, on domestic battery production or recycling. I'm here to tell every state I think that they can have their cake and eat it too. Sure, you might not have large deposits of copper or nickel that can ultimately be a part of a larger mining operation. But every other segment of the supply chain needs to be built out domestically. And that includes large-scale manufacturing projects like battery manufacturing operators or recycling companies, and ultimately creating that end-of-life interconnection, in the same place. I mentioned we don't really produce many of our public EV charging stations domestically right now. I can't honestly tell you what the reason for that is, other than I just assume it's cost, and those are hard things to get around. But all to say, I suspect there's opportunities there, and as long as the federal government is paying attention, at least for a little time, on this domestic supply chain, it seems a great opportunity to pair that up with state resources to ultimately make it a big a splash as possible.
So my last question for all of our guests is, if you had all the power in the industry, what would you do with it?
Yeah, I think it's the culmination of all of this, and I should sort of say this with a caveat that I'm an industry hack, and I've been in the space for 10 years. So but I do come from working in government, so I at least approach my comments with a touch of humility, in that I know just how hard it is not only to pass legislation, but to ultimately move the ball down the field in terms of progress when you're working in the public sector. I'd like to think that my comments, are somewhat aspirational, but hopefully, in sort of drenched in something slightly more attainable as well. So I guess all that I would say is that everything I've talked about today, I think, is all part of one holistic vision, which is that states need to approach the entire sort of life cycle of an electric vehicle, from the production phase all the way to end of life of the use of consumers, in a much more holistic fashion than they are now. The federal government, to me, rightly is looking at this as an opportunity for economic growth, and so there will be some resources coming out of legislation in the next 12 months or so that ultimately can be directed towards the domestication of that supply chain. But that, again, that's not as holistic as I would otherwise like. And I think the state that gets that right is really going to be in a great position for not only attracting business, but also providing its citizens with the best possible technology, the safest technology, the lowest cost technology to help that citizenry thrive. So I think it amounts to a governor ultimately taking the pen to pull together the collective leadership, moving and defining what the goal sets are based on what the individual state already has as part of its natural advantage. Maybe it's a great university system. Maybe it's a background or a history in advanced manufacturing. Maybe it is minerals. But it doesn't mean taking every piece of the pie. It means acknowledging that there are so many different areas here to capture, that you could form partnerships with other states to create these little mini closed loop systems for supply chains. It just requires that type of vision and imagination. But yeah, I think that's where I'd go with it. Is I'd love to see more states having a intentional conversation about how they want to approach this as a new system of economic, a new economic engine for their state.
So if people want to learn more about Lucid or get in touch with you, how would they go about doing that? If somebody wants to put their order in for a new Lucid Air, how do they go about it?
Yeah, so
asking for a friend.
Right. So unless there's a change in law, you'll have to go online to submit your information. We are hoping that we'll be able to get this change this year, which would allow us to invest resources in the state to put a sales and service location in the state, and ultimately provide consumers with a more accessible pathway for kicking the tires on a vehicle and so on. But you still have the opportunity to go onto the internet, check out the car, and to ultimately put a reservation in on a car. I should say that we do have a showroom in Chicago, so anyone feels like a jaunt down to the Windy City can ultimately go and visit our studio location there for the time being. We do hope to bring one much more proximate to Wisconsinites just as soon as we can, deal with some pesky legislation. As for me, like the company, I'm on social media, and then Kristen, I'm sure if there's any interest, you can share my email with anyone who wants to follow up with specific questions or have a conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks. I look forward to being back in Madison sometime soon.
Well, did you know that Madison Gas and Electric is building an EV charging hub in downtown Madison? The next time
That's great.
Yeah, the next time you're here, you might need to check it out. It's going to be a couple blocks away from the Capitol. They're going to have, I think, 8 fast chargers set up, and then a couple specific to Teslas as well. So it should be a really good opportunity for people who need a charge to park there, hang out downtown, and just have a good time here in Madison.
Yeah, the more the better at this point. I think, and that's great to see. It sounds like they'll be in a nice high profile location too. I think that's one of the key elements of this at this point is exposure to the technology, whether that comes in the form of the vehicles themselves or the infrastructure, preferably both at the same time, so you can see the infrastructure being used and all that good stuff. But hopefully it starts to give utilities a better data set for usage and the types and for dwell times and that kind of a thing. One of the things that I'm really I want to sort of highlight is to their credit, GM and Nissan did a lot of studying, and others. Frankly, I'm thinking of the BMW's Mini E, but those all were 80-mile range vehicles or less. And the profile for charging those vehicles is vastly different than any of the long-range vehicles that are out there today. Even the way that you charge your Nissan Leaf is frankly different than how you might do it if you had 2 or 3 times that range regularly at your disposal. And utilities, wanting to be very deliberate with their use of capital funds and showing a return on value, I think would be really best served to disregard a lot of the data coming from the last decade just because of the technological limitations of that. We don't even want our secondhand or third-hand owners driving those cars. They probably won't. We want them driving long-range electric vehicles with utility. And so, developing an infrastructure plan based on, technology from 10 years ago just strikes me as, you'll be back in the drawing board sooner rather than later.
Something to think about, and I know they are. All right, well, thanks again, Daniel. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen.
Bye-bye.
Thank you again to Daniel Witt for joining, and remember to subscribe to The Electric Wire wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss out on our upcoming episodes. You can also follow us on Twitter at The Electric Wire, and thanks to the members of the Customers First Coalition, including Dairyland Power Cooperative, Madison Gas and Electric, the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, WPPI Energy, Renew Wisconsin, the Citizens Utility Board, the IBEW 2150, and the Wisconsin Electric Cooperative Association. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in September.